So now we have time for some more discussion. Yes, thank you very much, Nick. That was really good. And we've already got some questions in the chat for both Beck and Cody and for Nick. So perhaps we'll start off with those. Joanna has asked you guys, Beck and Cody, have you identified specific activations that are more aligned with the needs of Indigenous communities?
Yeah, well, I guess it just is actually about what the community is wanting and asking for. Kobe's just here to prompt and give some suggestions. The examples that she was showing were just like examples of previous activations.
So all of those, it's their content. At the end of the day, we're skilled personnel or bungees, we're friends that come in to help them to digitize it, but I'm just a conduit for what they want to do. Sometimes people want to do exhibitions, so you saw 2 examples of exhibitions, and that was self-led by those communities. As an Indigenous curator, I apply my Indigenous methodologies to all of my projects, so they're always led by the community that holds the knowledge, not by me.
Yeah, that's a fantastic outcome of your project and really, really valuable. Okay, so there's some more questions. Candace is asking if you use or have developed data sovereignty protocols for your projects. I think that's a question for both the projects.
Yeah, so for ours, it's in-house and held by community as it stands at the moment. We haven't looked at any ways to share that outside of community. That'll just be held in-house at that art centre, and only personnel that are related to family will be allowed to access those files. When it comes to sharing further, that's why we've been talking to Milingimbi, because Milingimbi are basically like the cousins of that community. They even share language and language roots. Milingimbi has a bit more of a solid digitization foundation there. They've already got a lot of things up and running, but they are very similar in dialect and also in their song lines cross over each other. That's why we're looking at those 2 communities to look at kind of what already exists in Milingimbi, whether or not we want those ones to speak to each other so that they can cross-share that information, or whether or not this particular community just wants to keep it isolated to their community and only give access to people as they wish.
And a large part of the conversations that were being prompted by the RAM assessment was actually around policy and procedure and data sovereignty. So just undertaking the RAM assessment with both communities was prompting us to have those conversations and sort of talking about whether it was something that they would want to share outside of the community. And I was making sure throughout all of those processes that like it's incredibly clear that I don't hold a copy of, like, as someone coming from outside the community and going in to do some of that work, I don't hold a copy. It's all just completely within community.
Yeah, at the moment, the communities that we're working with aren't necessarily interested in those networks going live and then being able to share them across art centres or institutions, for example. They're looking at basic digitisation of those things and then kind of seeing how they can move forward from there. Because every art centre is at a different level with those things, and every art centre wants different things for their collections.
Yeah, that's really interesting. If the communities don't want to share, I know there's a lot of questions about how to set up automatic mechanisms for making sure material is only shared with the correct people through in some of the collections, some of the larger collections. But if the decisions are just being made to keep material on country, that's done by the community. So it's not sort of going to create protocols that are then necessarily extendable to other collections, are they?
Yeah. Not at this stage. It stays with the community. We see the community as a family. Within them, we're talking with the male and female representatives that are necessary, as well as Beck working with the art centre workers to upskill them in continuing those digitisation processes while we're not in community, and housing that within both the Land Council and the art centre. So there's skilled people across several of the if the organisations. So if the art centre closes for 6 months for some reason, then the Land Council has access to that. And that's all just very much in-house. They're not interested in sharing this with the National Museum of Australia or the Art Gallery of New South Wales at this point. They're looking at housing and figuring out what they've got, how they can have access and communicate with those materials. The next steps, like once we look at different communities and see how that pilots as we move out to different communities, we're not sure where that will lead us, but coming from the opposite end, where I've worked within major institutions and people have had to come to me to gain access to their materials and that kind of data sovereignty, we're doing it the opposite way, where that's just housed in-house for a reason, so that we don't have to have those conflicting cultural considerations that we run into quite often working in institutions. If they then later want to figure out a way to open access to some of that material and create a body of material to then house somewhere else, then definitely would be looking at having that as like a conversation later on down the track. But at the moment, honestly, the priority is digitizing these things, having a look to see what's out there in these different communities and figuring out which is the most at risk, and also figuring out those connections between a skilled personnel and cultural conduit, whether that's a Indigenous digitisation officer at a major museum, or whether that's a curator that has a connection with that community. That's kind of where we're at now.
So if I can just add, so Paradisic's quite a different sort of beast, really. I mean, in that it's got so many different languages and so much, so many different cultural sort of information from so many different cultures and languages, that what we've chosen to do is not to close things off. So if each item has deposit conditions put on it by the depositor, and we expect the depositor has negotiated that with the people that they've worked with. But we also have a lot of legacy material for which there is no clear deposit, there's no clear negotiation with anybody because it was done 50 or 60 years ago. So we use a takedown principle where we put the material up because we don't want to be the gatekeepers that so many holding institutions are, who say, we don't know what's in this, and so therefore we'll close it off and nobody will get access to it. And we don't think that's a productive way of dealing with this material. So we make it available. There is Australian material, for example, where we're told that somebody's died and the family would prefer that that material not be made available, so we can easily, we just close that off, and the catalogue allows us to do that straight away. So we do that, and we have done that. But it's a delicate, it's a delicate thing to figure out, but we have given it a lot of thought, and in the end we've decided, and this is in consultation with lots and lots of people over a long time, that we would do this. And we've actually never had anybody ask us to take anything down over the 22 years of activity. And we've had lots of people, really delight in finding records in their language, because they probably don't have any records in this language anywhere else except in Paradisic. So yeah, it's a balancing act.
So that sort of ties in with the question that's in the chat from Arif Nakvi, which is asking if there are conflicts over how open collections should be for access to outsiders from communities who may not understand the context or have sympathy towards the communities, and how well do licenses handle this issue?
Well, I mean, sorry, I'll just barge in again.
Nick, I think it's for you.
Well, so we assert the moral rights of the performers on our, as part of the license of use for the material. And ultimately, we think that if material's closed, the main people that will suffer for that are the people who are looking for material in their language. Bad people will always do bad things, and I don't think you should build systems trying to stop bad people doing bad things. I think you should try and build systems that make material available, that trust that people will do the right thing with the material according to the licenses, because they all sign an agreement when they come into the collection that they'll treat things with respect. So it's, yes, as I said before, it's a balancing act, but that's what we've decided to do.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, so has anyone else got any other questions for the presenters? Or I think Joanna is still here as well, if anyone wants to ask anything more about the Mexican projects, the winners of the Mexican awards. Josiah Peralta has asked, are there plans for continuing maintenance on the digital side?
Okay, yes. So, I mean, our collection is continually maintained. And I think the research object crate that I discussed is giving us a much more robust way of keeping the collection as a static object and allowing it to move. So we have it backed up in a few different locations. So yes, indeed, there's continuing maintenance, but also, you know, there are emerging technologies. So we want to be sure that we're able to take advantage of things, of new technologies as they arise.
On our end, my vision of it is kind of to see how it goes with different communities. And then I know places like IATSIS house a lot of our content. I would like to have conversations with different places like IATSIS and other peak bodies about holding those resources, even some Indigenous peak bodies like Desert or Anchor, for example. We're two people, so we can't hold and maintain this for the rest of our lives, and we want people to have that capacity to have access, but also there is a fine balance between access and privacy for these communities as well, and that needs to be managed, I think, regionally, in my perspective. Yeah,
and I think the crux of our project is kind of twofold in that we're trying to empower the First Nations communities that we're working with to care for their own digital content, but also and why I thought this project would be a really good pilot is there are so many non-First Nations digital preservation professionals who have skills, who want to help, but it's about maintaining relationships over time and not just sort of going in, doing some work and then leaving. So yes, absolutely, from our end, we were saying, to use a metaphor, that when we were in the community last, they planted a mango tree outside, and we said that we'd keep coming back until the mango tree can provide shade for the artists. So it's like still a tiny little tree. So we've got at least that long, and then hopefully by that point we won't be needed any longer, but we're here if we are needed.
Yeah, the idea is to try and figure out.
Sorry, we lost you for a bit, Cody. Could you just repeat your last sentence?
I just said our aim is to make those communities as self-sufficient and for them to self-determine their content as much as possible. And that's going to take time to pilot through different communities.
And it will be depending on sort of where digital technologies go and what's available and what that looks like in terms of practicality for different communities. So it really is a very case-by-case basis. How do you help them preserve their digital materials themselves? We're just training them at the moment. So we're working with one community of there's only about less than 1,000 people in that community.
Can I ask, so what platform are you using to deliver this stuff into the community?
At the moment, we have literally just been using like stored data on drives on computers, because it's really just like we're just trying to get as much digitized as possible and starting to get community members to start going through some of the content. I think in this next trip, we'll actually start having conversations and going back through the RAM assessments, sort of thinking about what that kind of digital storage and the various access points looks like, both within the community and if they do want to share their content with other communities like Milingimbi, they already have essentially a dam, and whether we want to, because of the sort of crossovers between the two, integrate or have something that sort of can talk to that in some way. Like it really just depends. But I think that will really come out over the next trip.
Which ties in with the other question that Meg sent about how do you help them to preserve the digital material themselves? So that's what you're talking about, Beck, isn't it? Is there anything more you wanted to say about that?
There's training modules as well. That's why we're looking at like piloting this one. There's art center workers in every art center. You have, I think it's like a, now we go on to the visual art side of things. So there's the art center managers, and then there's art center workers that work in every, what is that? Yes, it seems without these tools and funding, they might be a bit stuck. Every art center has their own funding and their own, they're self-sufficient. Within that, they have art center workers. It's usually one male and one female art center worker that work with the art center manager. We're looking at training up those people, as well as making sure all of those kind of decisions that are happening happen with the board and happen with the elders of the community. And then we filter that down to a training module that is training the art center workers. You know, I have gone in and taught art center workers across many art centers how to hang a painting, for example. It'll be the same sort of thing. They work with EMU and other systems as well. So they have systems that they're already familiar with. And it's a matter of figuring out what kind of digital systems are already existing within Buku, Lange Molka Art Centre, which is the biggest digital hub that we have in an Aboriginal art centre. Amazing digital school that is run through that, as well as like our existing ones at Milingimbi. We chose this community because they have absolutely nothing. It's just stuff in a box, in a cabinet. They're starting from ground zero and building up. So it's about figuring out what that community wants, how they can talk to the other communities, whether that's linguistically by bringing in a linguist from each of those communities so that they can search Dillibag in 16 different languages, or whether or not they just want that to be a localized.
And I think there's also often a sort of belief that because these communities are remote, it means they have sort of no technology and no digital literacy, and that's not the case at all either. Like, it's somewhere in between, depending on the community. And so like a lot of the kids have phones, and so they actually have really good digital literacy. And the idea of looking after sort of born digital content, they're like, yes, I get that concept. It's the sort of analog stuff that we're trying to get to a born digital, to a digitized state. So then it is kind of manageable. Like, it's just,
and without being like ageist, it does almost split into elders and young people, where the young people are interested in what Becky's doing, and the elders are more interested in having those digital assets, you know, cared for. So I'm looking at them for the protocols, and then the young people are getting excited to have all these new technologies in their community that they can play around with. And, you know, through that, they can get part-time job, you know, come in a couple of days a week and do the digitization. Done.
And part of the project is to leave the communities, like we're using some of the grant money to leave the communities with some tools, whether they be software or hardware, so that this work can continue without us being there, but we can do the training while we are there.
The idea is to not be flying out there every year to help digitize the next load of stuff, but just have them set up and ready, and then we're just there to be the troubleshooting aunties when necessary.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Joanne's put through another question about Peter Lucas Jones' work with the Maori media ecosystem. I don't know, can you see that in the chat rather than me reading it all out? It might be more sensible.
Well, you know, that's a specific context, and you know, in Aotearoa, they've got lots of protocols. They've really thought through a lot of these issues, and you know, essentially it's one big cultural group. It's one big language group. Obviously, there are some variations, and so it's easier, I suppose, for them to have protocols at a national level than it is certainly in Australia, but also in the Pacific, where you've got such a diversity of cultural groups and language groups. So absolutely, if we had Maori material, for example, if it were to be used in these contexts, then yes, it would probably go through their protocols. We don't actually have very much Maori material in our collection, because there is the archive of Maori and Pacific music in New Zealand already.
Within our context, we're working with like there's so many different language groups and dialects just within a couple of 100 Ks of each other. That's why we've working with Bulla, Ramingining, and Milingimbi, Yui, because they're like cousins. They're across from each other. They share the same song lines, so that's the same kind of histories. They have the same, they're like cousins. I don't know how else to explain it without giving you a lecture on Indigenous art. And so the easiest way to kind of figure out how you can knowledge share is to use the language groups that already knowledge share and figure out how that can then, I don't know, do we then do it blackfellow way and go through song lines? Do we then do it through language and how that changes? Because it changes as you go. Or there's different ways that we can do that, but figuring out how to do it within a family group of Arnhem Land where you have, you know, several different dialects that are spoken by several different language groups, that in itself is complex enough for us. Within the community of Ramingining, every speaker would be speaking 3 or 4 different dialects of Yolngu, as well as English, as well as Creole. So you've got 5 languages to consider within one human being within that community. And then if they're married up from somewhere where I'm from, then add another couple of dialects as well. So it's extremely complex.
And we're at the moment only 2 people. We're hoping to grow this so that we can involve more people. But I think we also don't want to be trying to replace a lot of the Indigenous peak bodies who can do a lot of that work. And
it's about fitting them into what already exists to create like digital excellence within Indigenous communities, not the opposite way around, where those kind of institutions and digital systems that are created by non-Indigenous people are then bastardized to create our needs. It's the opposite.
And yes, there are many Indigenous professionals who are in this space.
Heaps.
And we're hoping to work collaboratively with them in the future. And I think the point of our pilot project was to try and figure out how we could have non-First Nations and First Nations sort of cultural professionals working in a First Nations-led capacity. So yes, we're hoping very much to work with some of the other amazing Indigenous digital preservation professionals out there.
Yeah, basically from my perspective, usually the way that these kind of projects work is that there's a university or someone's doing a PhD and they're a skilled professional and they go into our communities, they work with those communities and then they leave. This was the community members literally asking me, we need a skilled person to come in and help us figure out how we can care for these things, how we can get access to these things. And we just have to wait at every step of those ways and be directed by their wants and needs as we go about that. The reason that I've decided to do that is because I've seen too many times where that happens and then the relationship between Aboriginal people and skilled person disintegrates over time. And that's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that that's a really healthy relationship in perpetuity. And so that's why, like, even just personality matches is really important. You know, I wouldn't really want to take Becky to the desert. She probably wouldn't cope as well as by the ocean. It's little things like that, understanding the individual skilled person that is going to go into that community and making sure that they feel as safe within that space as well, so that they can do their best job and have that long-standing relationship. We want to have those long-standing relationships with Ballanders. That's my word for white people, Ballander. That's the point of it, but we need to do it on our terms. And this is our way of showing you how to do it, how we're doing it on our terms with a very, very small community.
That's a fantastic case study. I mean, the DPC is really keen to stay involved with what you guys are doing because we think it's such a model for people to use in the future. So Arif has asked another question in the chat. You may have sort of answered that, Cody. Is there anything you want non-Indigenous professionals to be aware of so that they can be more helpful for what you're trying to achieve?
Just that we're doing it and we're trialing it. It'll take some time. I think after this kind of pilot's done, we'll want to be talking to some of our peak bodies on the art side and probably be talking and needing obviously help from you digital preservation masters. And so just trying to figure out how it works in this microcosm. And then we'll try and see if we can build the family and we'll have more cousin couples going out everywhere and helping people. But we're just, at the moment, it's just figuring out how the community wants to use UMOB first, and then I'll tell you.
Fantastic. That's really good because I know the DPC is looking at, we're trying to work on our community archive digital preservation toolkits, and we'd be really interested to get your input into how that works or should work in the future. Okay, so networks of care. That's great. Absolutely, Joanne. Has anyone else got any last minute questions? Well, we're almost to time. I suppose just to finish off, I'd be really interested to hear what the plans, both you and Nick, what your plans for your projects are this year in 2025.
Well, we'll shift the whole interface of the collection into the Arrow Crate view, which makes it much easier to access material. Because one of the problems we've got with a database is that you have to navigate a database, and it's sort of, a lot of people find that clunky. But you know, it's served us well, and that'll also allow us. One of the other issues that people have is they don't want to log in to a catalogue, and it's sort of problematic because that's the only point at which we can ask people to sign agreements, is when they log in, and also that we know what they're doing when they download files and whatever. But we are going to risk it. We're going to put up a clickable agreement, I think, and for most of the material that is openly available, it'll be quite openly available through this new system. So we're hoping to have that up by the middle of the year, and that's going to be quite exciting.
Great, thank you.
And on our project, we have stages 2 and 3 to sort of round out our pilot. So just to recap, stage 2 is going back into both communities, undertaking some further digitization and revisiting the RAM assessments that we did with them back in March of last year, just to see what has changed, what needs updating, and then what the sort of next steps are for both communities and how we can work with them to improve their digital preservation maturity. And then probably another trip maybe at the end of the year, which will be more focused on sort of working with the community to activate the archive in whatever way they see fit.
That's great. Thank you. It's so exciting to see both the projects moving forward. And yeah, we're really keen to stay connected with everything you're doing.